There was once a time when the Hobbits lived in distant lands, far from the comfort and peace of the Shire. A time when they were forced to overcome conflict and danger, as evil beings encroached upon their lands. It might be hard to imagine the Hobbits having to face these hardships, yet we shouldn't underestimate their determination to persevere and survive. For every time the Hobbits faced such an ordeal, they rose to the occasion, and they would manage to adapt by finding new homes that were safe from the evils of Middle-earth. In today's episode, we'll be unraveling the origins of the Hobbits and the many tribulations that they would have to endure before they could finally enjoy the peace and bliss of the Shire. So even though Hobbits and men looked quite different, they actually shared a common origin. For the Hobbits were a unique branch of men that had slowly evolved to have a short stature. It seems that the Hobbits would already exist by the end of the First Age, for Tolkien tells us that the beginning of the Hobbits lies far back in the Elder Days that are now lost and forgotten, and there are a few hints of what their lives were like in these ancient times. According to Tolkien, there was a time when the Hobbits were a savage people, and they lived primitive lives. Though after they started to mingle with other factions, they slowly began to change. For through these relations, the Hobbits embraced new customs and arts, and they became more civilized. Men were by far the biggest influence in their development, for the Hobbits could clearly see that they shared a close kinship with these people, and they were comfortable around them. The dwarves and elves also helped the Hobbits with their progress, though it was to a much lesser extent, for in those days the Hobbits felt uneasy around these races, for they saw them as alien, and their relationship was always clouded by fear. Even in those ancient days, the Hobbits never fought amongst themselves, and they tried to avoid war at all costs, though since they lived in a very harsh and hostile environment, they would have no choice but to fight at times in order to ensure their survival. As the years passed by, the Hobbits began to spread out and settle in different lands, and they formed Hobbit communities that had very different lifestyles from each other. The Hobbits would slowly start to adapt to their new environments and homes, and by the year 1000 of the Third Age, they had evolved into three distinct types of Hobbits: the Harfoots, the Stuars, and the Falahides. The Harfoots were by far the most numerous, and they were also the shortest type of Hobbit, and their skin was darker than that of the other clans. These Hobbits loved the highlands and hillsides, and they saw holes and tunnels as the perfect type of home, and so it should come as no surprise that these Hobbits chose to settle in the foothills of the Misty Mountains. Since they lived in the Misty Mountains, these Hobbits would often come across dwarves that lived nearby, or that were travelling across the mountains through the High Pass. And from these meetings, an interesting trade relationship was born between these two factions. The second clan of Hobbits were the Stuars, and they had a distinct sturdy build with broad shoulders, and they were the only type of Hobbit that could grow a beard. These Hobbits loved the plains and the riversides, and so they chose to settle close to the shores of the great river Anduin, and they were also less shy of men compared to their kinsmen. The last clan of Hobbits were the Falahides, and they were said to have a fair complexion and light hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the other clans. They were also the least numerous out of the three groups, and they preferred to hunt for food instead of farming. These Hobbits had a great love for trees and woodlands, and many of them would choose to settle in the forest of Greenwood the Great, or close to its borders. And we know that out of all the clans, the Falahides had the friendliest relationship with the elves, perhaps because they used to come across them at times in Greenwood the Great. These Hobbits were also quite bold and adventurous, and because of their nature they would often become the leaders and chieftains of the Hobbits, once all three clans were merged together. In fact, many of the greatest and most important families in the Shire, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland, had a very strong Falahide strain. Now, even though all of these Hobbit clans had their own distinct lands, They all seem to live in the general area of the northern valleys of the Anduin, and this region also happened to be the home of the Northmen, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. These men had a close relationship with the Hobbits, and it seems that these factions developed together, for the most ancient form of the Hobbit language was actually very similar to the language of Rohan. The Hobbits would even become a part of the folklore of these men, for legends of the halflings were passed down from generation to generation, and these stories were still shared among the Rohirrim toward the end of the Third Age. Now, for a while, it seemed like the Hobbits had found the perfect home, for they were happy and comfortable in their lands, and they had built good relationships with the men that lived nearby. Yet unfortunately, this happiness could not last. For an ancient and terrible evil known as the Necromancer had infiltrated the forest of Greenwood the Great, and he began to summon his servants to this land. And so a shadow would slowly consume this once beautiful forest, and it became a dangerous place known as Mirkwood. This new evil was actually Sauron in disguise, and many of his wicked servants answered his summons, including a faction of men known as the Easterlings, who settled in the forest of Mirkwood. It was clear that these men weren't looking for peace, but instead they were planning to invade the nearby lands, and the Hobbits knew that it was only a matter of time before their lands and lives would be at risk. The Harfoots were the first clan to act on this, and in the year 1050 of the Third Age, they set forth on a great journey across the Misty Mountains to reach the land of Eriador, and they built many small villages in this land that even extended as far as Weathertop. It would take another 100 years before the Stuars and Fallowhides decided to follow their kinsmen into the west, and these two clans would take different paths to reach their new lands. For the Fallowhides had decided to cross the mountains to the north of Rivendell, before following the river Horwell, and they were eventually integrated into the Harfoot settlements, while the Stuars had crossed these mountains through the High Pass, and they then travelled southwards by following the river Brunnen, until they reached an area where these two rivers met each other. This land was known as the Angle, and many of the Stuars decided to settle here, though some of them would travel further south, and they occupied the lands between Tarbad and the borders of Dunland. It's quite likely that these lands reminded the Stuars of their old homeland, for they were also flatlands and close to the rivers, and so they would naturally appeal to them. It seems that while the Stuars lived in these lands, they must have come across the men of Dunland, for some of the Stuars that lived close to its borders would slowly adopt a language that was quite similar to Dunlandish. Now, even though the Hobbits had found a new home in the west, they wouldn't manage to escape from the growing evil in Middle-earth. For in the year 1300, a new threat arose in the north, the kingdom of Angmar, under the rule of the Witch-King. Its purpose was to utterly destroy the northern kingdom of the Dunedain, and the Hobbits knew that their lives were at risk once more, and so the Harfoots and Fallowhides abandoned their settlements, and they fled to the south, where they eventually found refuge in the town of Bree. They would find that the men of these lands were very welcoming, and they readily accepted the Hobbits, and over time a strong friendship would grow between them. The Hobbits also seemed to like living among these friendly men, for they appreciated that these men were much stronger than they were, and they could protect them from the many dangerous enemies that lurked outside, or even other hostile men. Now, the impending invasion of Angmar was also a threat to the Stuars that lived in the Angle, and these Hobbits would end up divided, for some of the Stuars decided to travel to the west and join the other clans in Bree, while others felt that their best chance of escaping this evil was to travel to the south and make their way past the Misty Mountains, so that they could return to their old lands near the Gladden Fields. These Stuars that returned to their old home would go back to a wilder and more primitive lifestyle compared to the other Hobbits, for they would start to live in small and dwindling communities, while the rest of their kinsmen in the west would develop strong, cohesive societies. They would also lose all contact with the Hobbits that lived in Eriador, and we know that Gollum was actually a descendant of these Sturs. Unfortunately, it seems that these Stur communities that were built in the Gladden Fields would eventually die out or were abandoned, for we know that none of these communities remained by the time Gandalf became suspicious of the One Ring. Now, in the year 1601, there were two Falahide brothers in Bree, called Marcho and Blanco, who wanted to lead a group of hobbits into the west, past the Brandywine River, so that they could settle in new lands. These lands belonged to King Argaleb II, the ruler of the Dunedain of the north, and they were once used as a hunting ground, a royal park, and a rich farmland. However, over the years these lands became untended, and they were falling into wilderness, and when the hobbits presented their request to the king, he saw it as a good opportunity. For the king knew that the hobbits were skilled in the arts of cultivation and agriculture, and they would be able to take care of his lands and enrich them once more. And so the king gave the hobbits permission to settle in these lands as long as they agreed to some terms. They would have to become his subjects and follow the laws of his land, and they would also have to keep the bridges of the Brandywine River repaired at all times. And finally, the king must also be allowed to hunt in the woods and moors of this land 3 times a year. The hobbits felt that these terms sounded fair, and they accepted the king's offer. And when they finally crossed the Brandywine River, they immediately fell in love with their new land, which they called the Shire, and they counted this moment as the start of their calendar, the Shire Reckoning. News of this wondrous land would eventually reach the Sturs that had remained in Dunland, and in the year 1630 they left their homes to join their kinsmen in the Shire. The hobbits would respect their allegiance to the King of Arnor, and in the year 1976 they would send some archers to the Battle of Fornost, though unfortunately this battle would end in the utter defeat of the Northern Kingdom, and the Dunedain that survived became the Rangers of the North. Since there was no longer a king to rule these lands, the hobbits of the Shire were left without a ruler, and so they decided to elect a thane from among their numbers, who would rule instead of the king. So this wraps up today's video, and we hope you enjoyed it. What do you think about the origins of the hobbits and the great journeys that they had to undertake? And were there any particular hobbit clan that appealed to you? And if so, why? As always, we'd like to give a quick shout out to all the patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help makes this channel possible, and your support is deeply appreciated. Particularly the Valar tier patrons, Jacob Williams, Michael Angel, and T. Gorman, and the Wizard tier patrons, James Stodgel, Andrew Burma, Mike Feeney, Roland Meervold, and Tamar Baines. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, we'll be leaving a link to the Patreon page in the video description. You could also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. Until next time, when we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.